Hello and welcome to this AHDB webinar examining the impact of exiting the EU on the ornamentals industry. I'm Wayne Brough, AHDB Knowledge Exchange Manager for ornamentals, and in this, the second of two webinars, we explore the impact of sourcing, or the impacts on sourcing and retaining labour. Before I introduce today's programme and speakers, just a few housekeeping points. You'll see there that the audience is on mute. But you can still pose questions. I will come back to this in the next slide in a moment. The actual webinar will last an hour and a half, including about 20 minutes question and answer session. It will be recorded, so if you do need to leave or you need to pass it on to colleagues, it will be available later on this week on the AHDB website. There is a handout available with this showing everybody's slides, and I'll come to that in a moment and how to download it. And basis points are available with this particular webinar, and Heather has sent out the forms beforehand. So if you do need basis points, please complete them and send them back to Heather in due course. So in terms of handouts and questions, you should see something similar in terms of your GoToWebinar functionality in the top right-hand corner. If you do need to minimize the box, please press the red button with the white arrow at the top left-hand side there. But before you do so, just a couple of important points to sort of highlight to you. If you'd like to pose a question, then please click the grey question bar, and then from the drop-down menu, just type in the question you'd like to pose to the speaker. Please submit questions throughout the entire presentation, because we won't be taking questions until the very end. So please send them through. I'll keep an eye on them and pose them to the appropriate speaker at the end. The handout, if you'd like a copy of the slides from today's webinar, please click the grey handout bar, and from the drop-down menu, click the handout and download the handout, and you'll have all the slides to hand. As I said before, the actual recording will be made available later this week on the AHDB website. In terms of the actual programme, the programme, as I say, is going to run for about an hour and 10 minutes with 20 minutes question and answers at the end. We've got 5 speakers today. We'll be starting with Ali, who will be talking about accessing seasonal labour in 2021, and then David about the UK rules for overseas workers and what they mean for ornamental horticulture. Mark from Grampian Growers and Francis from Volmary will then be giving their own perspectives on sourcing and managing labour after EU exit. And then finally, we've got Jacqui wrapping up with the future of app-based labour recruitment. So just to say a few things about each presenter before we commence. Ali is first and foremost a grower of dessert and cider apples and hops, but her work includes membership of the boards of Y-Fruit, British Hop Association, the Norton Cider Growers Association, chairman of the NFU National Horticulture and Potatoes Board, British Apples and Pears, and Y Hops. David is the head of strategic insight in the AHDB intelligence team. Mark Clark is managing director of Grampian Growers, a farmer-owned cooperative based on the east coast of Scotland and growers of both daffodils and potatoes. Francis is the operations manager at Volmary, who are young plant propagators based at Wisbech St Mary. And finally, Jacqui was the CEO of Berry Gardens, but has recently established Viridis Associates to advise businesses. She is supporting CropDesk technologies to commercialise the seasonal job apps, which she'll be talking about today. So without further ado, if I can now pass on to Ali, and Ali will be talking about accessing seasonal labour in 2021. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wayne, and good afternoon, everyone. Just checking that you can all hear me. Hopefully Wayne or Heather or somebody will just say yes.
Yep, coming through loud and clear.
Going to keep brilliant. Okay, thanks, Wayne. It's lovely to be here, and I've got the sun shining in through the window. So if I start to squint, it's not because I'm frowning at you all. It's just it's such a beautiful day, and I'm not going to shut the sunshine out because I don't know about you, but I don't feel like we've seen enough of it recently. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon talking about seasonal labour. Obviously, for those of you who know me well, you know it's one of my pet subjects. I would also just like to, before I start, just reflect on the fact that actually for ornamental growers, this has probably been one of the toughest starts to a calendar year, not just because of COVID lockdown, but Brexit has brought, well, some might argue a double, triple triple or quadruple whammy with all of the new systems that everybody's having to get used to. There was a plant health webinar that the NFU ran yesterday, so if there are still plant movement concerns that anybody on this call wants to understand, you will be able to access that through the NFU online website. So to seasonal labour, I'd like to thank the AHDB team very much for hosting this webinar today. It's true to say that actually the last few weeks, in fact probably a few months, have not been very easy for the AHDB team, and I think they have risen to the challenges that various ballots have brought to bear. So it's great that we're all here and able to see some of the good work that's going on. And I hope that in the presentation that I'm about to give, what comes over loud and clear is that alongside AHDB, NFU is doing a huge amount of really hard work, really a lot of heavy lifting actually on seasonal labour, and in particular a lot of heavy lifting on the detail, because my God, there's been quite a lot of detail that we've had to deal with, not just on the policy itself, but also in terms of COVID. So first of all, just looking at the piece as a whole, there are a number of routes to recruitment. It's become very complicated actually for growers to really get their heads around. And of course, I'm very conscious that the bubble here on this slide in green, the seasonal worker pilot scheme, is something that anybody who isn't growing an edible crop is currently excluded from, which is something that the NFU has lobbied very hard for. We continue to make the case to government. But as with the launch of the pilot scheme back in 2018, and when we were lobbying for the expansion last year, it became very clear that this is a highly, highly political issue. So political that it wasn't something that DEFRA could take forward alone. It wasn't something that the Home Office could take forward alone. It was something that ended up in Cabinet, and it was a Cabinet decision. It was very clear that the only way that the decision was going to be made was on the basis of supplying food. And whilst as an ornamental grower, as a non-edible grower, I'm sure you will be very disappointed by that. Pragmatically, I have to take a step back and say that for the sector as a whole, for a sector that needs 70 to 80,000 seasonal workers each year, it was really important that the pilot, and it's still a pilot, is able to bring a decent proportion of those for the sector as a whole. Because if it is able to do that, then that does mean that there's more workforce in other places for those parts of the industry that can't access this. So it's not ideal, but the seasonal workers pilot, huge amounts of effort, daily conversations, weekly meetings, and a lot of heavy lifting politically got us from a pilot for just 10,000 workers last year to an expansion to 30,000 for 2021. That expansion is dependent on the awarding of 2 new operator licenses to 2 additional businesses. At the moment we have Proforce and Concordia running that pilot, and 2 new businesses are due to have a license awarded, and we are awaiting that decision. The request for information was released with the announcement on the 23rd of December 2020, and we believe that the decision is now sitting with Home Office, and we would expect an announcement in the next couple of weeks. It's finger-bitingly tight in terms of timing. I am well aware that it's making everybody very nervous and very anxious because, of course, for asparagus growers, the season is almost upon them. For the main crop, the main horticultural crops, we really need to see the workforce ramping up in April, May and June. And until those licenses are awarded, it's difficult for those 30,000 to come. So there's a lot of anxiety and focus and attention on getting that over the line. Moving on to EU settled status. EU settled status is an area where there's a lot of question marks, and there's a lot of question marks because whilst there's a high number of people with settled and pre-settled status, some living here permanently, but very many residing in the EU and hoping to come for all or part of the year, I think there's a big question mark over whether they will come back to our sector or whether they will come to work in other sectors. And of course, that's the one thing that we don't know. My crystal ball has got a bit murky on all of this. So what proportion of those that were working in our businesses last year with settled or pre-settled status will be coming back this year? We don't know. Historically, those numbers have been as high as, across the sector, 50%, and in some of the really excellent businesses as high as 70 or 80%. We've put 20 to 30% on the slide. We just don't know. The NFU is measuring this though every month, but the EU settled and pre-settled nationals are a very important route to recruitment. And just to be clear, if you have a worker from the EU who is not here at the moment, but was in the UK within the last 6 months, and they still haven't got their settled or pre-settled status, they can still apply until June the 30th. And they don't need to be in the UK to apply. I'll come on to guidance on some of this in just a sec. There's a huge political focus from the government on the recruitment of domestic workers, which is the third, the second amber blob on the slide. And last year, the sector achieved overall 11% UK national recruitment. And I need to be clear, UK resident, not UK national, UK resident. So no doubt there will have been some EU workers who are living here permanently in that total. The government is determined, and of course this is in the context of COVID, furlough schemes, and the prospect of significant unemployment. The government is determined that the sector will continue to try and recruit domestically. We all know what the difficulties with that are. We all know there are difficulties with very often the rural nature of some of the businesses versus where the population is living. And we all know and understand very well that these are roles that often, not always, are not attractive to a resident workforce because of the seasonal nature of the work, because it's not year round. I hasten to say it's not about pay. We often provide a better package overall than many of the industries that we tend to compete with: factories, warehouses, edge of town, care homes, construction, etc. There will continue to be that focus, and I would recommend to everybody on the call that you have a look at gov.uk find a job, and that it's a DWP run website that allows you to post a job. This is quite important this year because government will be measuring the success rate of our sector recruiting using their own portal. And of course, we need data and evidence to continue to make the case for why seasonal work does require a special scheme. I'm not sure I made it clear enough actually when I was talking about the scheme. We will continue to press government that the ornamentals, the non-edible sector, must be included in that scheme in the future. There is also a smaller group down here, the YMS, that's the Youth Mobility Scheme. There was talk last year that that would be opened up to EU nationals. That still hasn't happened. I don't know whether it's going to happen, but it clearly was a consideration for government at one point. That is a scheme that you might consider for longer term or permanent posts, and it will bring non-EU nationals, and that it's predominantly open to the members of Commonwealth countries. We've put in red the Kickstart scheme and frontier workers because despite growers' best efforts on both actually neither are proving to be a reliable source of a workforce, either permanent or seasonal. I've had a number of businesses in our sector apply to the Kickstart scheme and not succeed. So that's the landscape this year. I think I would just want to reflect on challenges. COVID has been really challenging for everybody. I think the one bit of brilliant news is the vaccination programme. So on that, every seasonal worker who is here in the UK, if they register with the local GP practice, will definitely be able to get a vaccine if they've missed that opportunity in their own country. And that's been confirmed a number of times to the NFU team. So if you were wondering about that, it's just a simple registration at the local GP surgery. COVID travel, though, and test restrictions continue to be a real challenge for the sector, despite the fact that there are exemptions on the day 2 and day 8 test for anybody entering the UK. We've had a number of instances where workers have been not allowed to enter without paying for that, even though they don't need to. And there have been travel restrictions as well. We've had instances of people being turned back from borders because they haven't got settled or pre-settled status. And again, there's it's a piece of work called Right to Work. In the first 6 months of this year, there is a grace period for EU nationals where they do not need to. In fact, it's deemed illegal for us to ask for that right to work check to see their settled or pre-settled status. And that is because they have a grace period for the first 6 months that enables them to continue to apply. And I'll come back to where you can get guidance on this in a sec as well. We are deeply concerned about drops in returnee rates, and we've seen actually since the referendum there's been a year-on-year drop in returnee rates, and that's something again that the NFU is measuring and monitoring every month. The time to appoint pilot operators I've reflected on, and then of course we've got the end of furlough. I think when I wrote this presentation, furlough was due to end at the end of June, and of course now it's going on and into the autumn. What does that mean for our sector? Well, it probably means that if furlough isn't going to end until the autumn, that the opportunity for us to recruit furloughed workers for seasonal work has diminished even more. So I am quite concerned about this challenge that the government is laying down to us to recruit a domestic workforce, because if they're not unemployed and they're furloughed, I can't see the motivation. So just moving on to my final slide, please, Heather. Really, this final slide is just to try and signpost you, because this landscape has become the most complex I've known it in the 5 years that I've chaired the board. There are various vlogs, that means video blog, hopefully a helpful introduction on sourcing seasonal workers, on the right to work checks. This is quite a complex area. We're all used to checking very thoroughly that our workforce has a legal right to work. And we've got this funny situation for the first 6 months where we're not allowed to do that. So for EU nationals, that's quite odd. Obviously, that doesn't apply to UK nationals and it doesn't apply to non-EU. But there's a very good article on the NFU website about right to work checks. The EU settlement scheme, if you want more information on that, is there, and so is the points-based system. So that's for permanent recruitment in the future, which again doesn't serve our sector terribly well for the jobs that are classed as unskilled by government. Not unskilled in my view, but they are looking through the lens of the current policymakers. And there's also a future immigration overview. So there's lots of information on the NFU website. If you haven't had a look, please do. I'm very accessible, Ali Kappa at mac.com. Don't hesitate to get in touch with either myself or a member of the NFU team if you want more information. And I'm looking forward to taking questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellie, for that fantastic overview. If we can now quickly move on to David, and David will fill in the gaps and add a little bit more information to Ali's presentation. Just to remind people, if there are questions, please don't forget to sort of pose questions as we go through the presentations, and I'll pose them to the speakers at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks, Ali. Yeah, my name's David Swales. I work in the market intelligence team here at AHDB. So as part of my role, I have to sort of analyze and crunch lots of data, and I've been doing a bit of that ahead of the webinar today. So I'm not an expert on ornamental horticulture. I'll hold my hands up at the start, but I have looked at lots of data on issues related to labour in your sector, and I'm happy to give you my take on what I think it means. And you may agree or disagree with me as you see fit in the questions and answers session towards the end. So in short, in terms of what I'm going to conclude today, I think I'm looking at the data, it looks to me that both seasonal and permanent roles are going to get much more difficult to recruit given the new rules which have come in on the 1st of January. And I think it's likely that salary rates will also be pushed up. So I'll go through and just talk you through some of the issues here. And I'm also going to highlight 4 key actions which I think you can take to hopefully mitigate the impact this has on your businesses. So firstly, just to put these changes into a broader context, yeah, we know that for good or bad, the leaving the EU on the 1st of January or leaving the transition period on the 1st of January has resulted in an awful lot of change, which has affected a lot of businesses. AHDB did some impact modelling to assess what this would mean, and we found that there was change in 3 main areas which are highlighted on the slide here. So we saw change occurring in terms of domestic policy, in terms of agricultural policy, changes in terms of how we trade and the amount of sort of trade friction costs businesses would experience moving goods to and from the EU. And finally, in the area which we're focusing on today, in terms of labour, with the end of free movement and the introduction of the new points-based system. So at HDB, we've done a lot of work on all of these issues. And what we've found is that the different issues play out differently for different businesses. And for horticulture generally, we did note that labour is by far and away the biggest impact for horticultural businesses. But I mean, how your individual business will be affected could well vary from that. So there's a lot of information on our website which you can access. There's reports, there's analysis, there's signposting to relevant government advice, which hopefully will be helpful to you and give you a bit more information. But certainly labour is the key issue for the sector, and that's for a whole range of reasons, but most significantly the sector is very labour intensive. So we know that labour costs account for around about 40% of costs across horticulture, which compares to only 11% for the agriculture sector. So really significant labour use within the sector. And we also know that the sector has traditionally been reliant on a high use of EU migrant labour. So that's in both the permanent roles where EU workers account for about 20% of roles, but most significantly in these seasonal roles, which Ali has spoken to already, and I mean potentially 60 to 70,000 seasonal roles, with the vast majority of those taken up by migrant workers. And we also expect that some of the costs for labour are likely to rise as a result of EU exit. So the impact assessment AHDB did highlighted that basically it would mean there's a smaller pool of labour out there for employers to fish in. And that would affect businesses both directly and indirectly, in that if a business is trying to recruit from the EU, it's obviously going to find that harder to do so. But also all the other businesses which we're competing with labour for, if they're restricted in terms of where they can access labour, we'll be competing with those for a smaller pool, and it's likely therefore that there'll be upward price pressure in terms of wage rates. So in terms of how the rules have changed, we hear a lot of talk about the new points-based system, and that has a number of elements. But my reading of this is perhaps the key route which is likely to be the most relevant for your sector will be what is termed the skilled worker route. And the government here has outlined a sort of set of criteria which jobs will be matched against to see if they are suitable. And you can see here the aim is to get up to or get a minimum of 70 points made up from these criteria. So this came in on the 1st of January. Yeah, the skilled worker route requires people to get to 70 points. So there's been a lot of press coverage of this, which you may have picked up, and most of that has focused on the salary levels on the right-hand side of this chart and the requirements there. But for me, perhaps the key requirement is this in the first column here, the job at appropriate skill level. And as Ali has alluded here, the requirement of the skilled worker route is actually quite restrictive for a lot of roles in the ornamental horticulture sector. So the first question you need to ask if you're going down this route is, does the vacancy I have qualify? As I say, I mean, the government has done a bit of a mapping process, and what they've done is defined roles which they see as meeting this skilled worker requirement. And their basic requirement is that the job has to be a level 3 or a level 4 qualification level. So that's basically to say they feel the job requires A levels or equivalent, or degree level qualifications or equivalent. And they've done a basic mapping which you can get to on the gov.uk website. So the types of occupations on the left-hand side, the government deems as being suitable for this route. The ones on the right-hand side, they feel do not. So you'll see there, I mean, there are potentially a number of roles which would meet this criteria, such as horticulture managers, nursery managers, gardeners, horticultural foremen. So there's a range of jobs which would be seen as skilled. But if you look on the right-hand side, maybe jobs such as pickers, labourers, nursery attendants, so on and so forth, wouldn't be viewed as skilled. So they would almost fail at the first hurdle. And the government's view would be we should be sourcing domestic labour for those types of roles. So this is obviously predominantly aimed at permanent type roles, and we've heard a little bit about seasonal workers already. And here, I guess, I mean, I would agree with Ali. The 30,000 pilot is a really good step forward, albeit is restricted to the edible sector only. But the fact those workers are in the workforce will hopefully make it easier for you guys to source domestic recruitment. And we've done some monitoring of this over the past year. For me, COVID has been a real challenge. And looking at what happened last year, it was almost a bit of a dry run through of what would happen if it was very difficult to recruit migrant workers into the sector. And what we found, the data here is from our horticulture labour barometer. What we found last year is that quite a proportion of the industry was able to recruit the workers it needed. Even with the restrictions around recruitment which we experienced during horticulture, and certainly the recruitment challenges which people expected weren't as bad as expected. But there was an awful lot of publicity and an awful lot of push around this with the Pick for Britain scheme and other issues, and obviously particular challenges around furlough and unemployment. So I think thinking about a domestic workforce is certainly something I think everyone should be considering doing for this year, and what we can do there. And what I would encourage you to do is just have a think about your recruitment methods in terms of how you bring in labour. And some of the later presenters are going to talk a little bit about this in a bit more detail, but we do know that most businesses tend to rely on just word of mouth for their main recruitment method, and relatively few undertake multiple methods of recruitment. What I would encourage you all to do is have a bit of a think about how you go about attracting people in, how you go about recruiting, and don't just rely on one basic method. Have a think about what the alternatives are, and try to get out there and get your message out, because if people don't know your job's available, they're not going to apply for it. So there is quite a bit of advice on the AHDB website about how you can go about recruiting domestically, and some tools and some advice which you may find useful there. Wages are obviously a critical issue in attracting people to your role, but they're not the only thing. So there's a range of other benefits and things which you'll be offering as part of your role. So have a think about how you're advertising and how you attract people in. This graph shows how wage growth is changing. So it may surprise many of you that we are currently seeing wage growth in the economy. We've seen blips when there's been these big recessions, but the economy has tended to recover relatively quickly afterwards, and wages have moved back into growth quite quickly. So over the last few years, across the economy as a whole, wages have tended to be increasing year on year about sort of 2 to 4% each year. And we do know that actually horticulture has probably been going a bit quicker than that. So the NFU did a piece of work on this last year, where they highlighted the impact of the national minimum wage in helping to drive salary levels. So I suspect for horticulture, the sort of salary increases you're seeing are probably a bit higher, maybe around about the 5% per year level. So do you know what I mean? And I think there's potential for wages to carry on increasing at that type of level as we see it harder to recruit workers from abroad. And that's predominantly because salary levels in some of those sectors which we'll be competing with for workers tend to be a bit higher than in agriculture and horticulture. So you just need to bear that in mind, I think, in terms of the recruitment you do this coming year. And for me, it's really important, and probably a real key takeaway message for me is given those difficulties which we expect on recruitment, keeping hold of your existing workforce is really important. And we know that one way of doing that is to train and develop your workforce. People are more likely to stay in businesses who take those methods, take those steps to train and develop them. So across agriculture and horticulture as a whole, around about 40% of the workforce has received some form of training in the last year. And this isn't just training in terms of going on a course, it would include on the job and off the job training. So it might include job specific things, health and safety, induction or management, a whole host of things. And certainly there's a bit of a challenge here for us all to think about, are we doing enough training and development to help maintain and develop our current workforce? And if you are going to invest in training, have a think about talking to the individuals who are training before they go on the course, so they understand why they're undertaking that training, and then follow up with them afterwards to make sure that training is being correctly implemented. And my last point here is that not all good staff make really good supervisors and managers. So advisory training, management and leadership type training, just as important as the technical training you might be doing as a business. Oh, I've come into the office and I'm not moving about enough, so the lights have gone off. Apologies for that. So as I said, I was going to highlight 4 key issues which I think are steps which you may want to take now to hopefully mitigate some of these challenges for your own businesses. So the first one I think is really important, that the rule book has changed significantly. There's lots of new requirements out there, so it's really important, I think, to familiarise yourself with the new rules. And there's lots of information and advice out there. So there's obviously information on the NFU site. AHDB has got information out there as well, and there's really good information on the government site. So if you are going down this skilled workers route, for example, you need to be registered as a licensed sponsor, and that process will take at least 8 weeks. So it's important you take steps ahead of time in order that you can be ready when you need to be. Domestic workers, for me, that's going to be a really key source for you going forward. And we had a bit of a dry run through last year. For me, we are expecting a bit of a challenging labour market. There could well be more opportunities to recruit domestic workers than there have been in the past. But have a think about the recruitment methods you use in order to attract them to your business. Third, highlighting the importance of holding on to your existing staff. So we know it's going to get harder to recruit. So you really do challenge yourself to make sure you're doing everything you can to maintain and keep hold of your existing workers. And finally, I think making efficient use of your workers is really key. So optimizing your labour use, either by investing in technology or efficient labour use. There's lots of information out there on lean, for example, and AHDB has a lot of resources there which may help you get the better use out of the workers you do use. So you may be asking what AHDB are doing to help around this, and I think there's 2 main areas. There's 3 big areas of work in our new strategy. The first 2 of those I think are really relevant here. So we're certainly helping to provide the evidence, and government really does look for evidence in this area to inform its decision making. So things like the Horticulture Labour Barometer hopefully help there. And we also want to support your business performance. So things like the Smart Hort programme and the Farm Excellence programme are there really to help you and identify things which businesses can do to move forward and develop in the medium to long term. So hopefully that's a little bit of food for thought, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have later on. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for expanding on those points. Now for a couple of grower perspectives and current situations. So if we can start with Mark, who's going to be giving an introduction to the way Grampian growers have dealt with labour so far this year. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. I assume everyone can hear me and on the call today?
Yep, you're fine.
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to echo one of the points that Ali made in her presentation, just to thank AHDB for the sort of privilege to speak with the audience this afternoon, and in particular also the hard work that AHDB have been doing over the last, in particular, the difficult last two or three months. So I just really wanted to start with that. A little bit of an introduction in terms of who we are. We're a farmers cooperative. We were formed in 1968 by 6 local farmers, of which 5 of these family farms are still active members in the cooperative. Initially, we grew daffodil flowers, daffodil bulbs and strawberries, and then we came out of strawberries in the mid-90s. In terms of the structure of Grampian growers, we are what we call owned by 12 A shareholder members. They own the co-op. They have invested £1 in the last 52 years, so not an overly financial onus in terms of the membership. And then we have 25 B members, which we are primarily potato members, and they utilise the premises, which you'll see in the middle photograph at Logie, roughly halfway between Dundee and Aberdeen, near to the town of Montrose. As I say, we're involved in the production and marketing of daffodil flowers, daffodil bulbs and seed potatoes. As a business right back from 1968, we are predominantly focused on exports. We export flowers to USA, Canada and mainland Europe, as well as UK. 50% of our daffodil bulbs go to America, 45% to mainland Europe, and literally a few trucks are sold in the UK. And our seed potatoes primarily export, again, North Africa, Middle East and Far East, as well as UK. Currently, we have 18 full-time members of staff spread across the 3 divisions. In terms of potatoes, we have a full-time sort of squad of sort of 10 are with us about 11 months of the year. So although they're in with sort of seasonal bracket, they're there most of the time. And then in terms of bulb season, flower season, we have up to about 70 folk in the pack house, depending on the volume of flowers and bulbs. We produce on behalf of our members and market about 60 million stems of daffs, 100 million daffodil bulbs, and 20,000 tonnes of seed potatoes per annum. We're what may be classified as a sort of small to medium enterprise business with a turnover of about 13 to 14 million pounds. Turnover split between roughly 10% flowers, 35% bulbs, and 55% potatoes. I'm going to focus primarily on flowers because we've just literally started in the last sort of 48 hours. And look at the sort of issues that we have. There'll be a bit of Scottish-ism in this sort of presentation, primarily because some of the rules up here are possibly a little bit different from south of the border. So a little look at where historically our labour has come from. So I'm going to sort of encompass both the co-op and its sort of members. So in a typical season, our 12 A shareholder members look for about 300 flower pickers. So we're nothing of the scale of the big guys in Cornwall or Lincolnshire, but we're a reasonable sort of scale up here. We do have 3 other growers of daffodils and flowers in pretty much in the neighbourhood. So historically, back in the 70s, 100% of our labour was sourced locally from the sort of local towns and villages. And then once we got into the sort of 80s, we started to see the sort of first of sort of Polish labour primarily coming in to pick our flower crop. And then as we went through the sort of 90s and into the sort of noughties, it was the Latvians and Lithuanians that started to appear. And then probably more recently for us, the Romanians and Bulgarians. So over that sort of 50-year period, we have lost, I would suggest, 95% of the local labour that are simply not interested in coming out. Ali mentioned in terms of the sort of pick for Britain and the primarily the fruit industry, we are surrounded by the big 3 fruit growers are within a stone's throw of where we are at Montrose. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it was somewhere about 11% of their labour requirement came from sort of local, and that was on the back of the sort of current furlough scheme where people could come out to work in this case, the sort of fruit industry. So not overly successful. I often use the analogy of the sort of fruit growers around us in polytunnels in primarily summertime or summertime, as opposed to in 4 degrees and it's often sleet and snow out in the open air picking flowers. It's a very different. So our success rate this year and for the last 15-20 years will probably be pretty limited. We are very fortunate if there's anyone on the call today that is growing flowers in primarily Cornwall or Lincolnshire. Thank you very much, because we get often very qualified and skilled flower picking labour coming north to Scotland, be either direct from Cornwall or indirect through Lincolnshire and then to Scotland. Agency labour, we have used agencies in the past. I would say there's less of them available now than there used to be back in the sort of 80s and the 90s. So we are more reliant on that flow of labour direct from Cornwall and Lincolnshire. We also have about 15% of our direct labour coming in from Eastern Europe. This is an area that we have been fighting quite sort of strongly with NFU Scotland and with Scottish Government and DEFRA, because we are deemed to be a non-essential industry, which I'll cover in a minute. So that labour that would normally come in direct to Scotland from either Latvia or Lithuania in our case, are unable to come in because of that industry that we're operating in being non-essential. So barriers to success, as I say, this tag that we have of non-essential flower industry is pretty much a sort of a burden. It's like carrying a big boulder on your shoulder. It gets quite annoying. It impacts on our business. Ali mentioned in terms of the SAWS scheme, we are not, because we are a non-edible crop that we're handling, and that we apply to both flowers and bulbs. We're not eligible for the seasonal agricultural workers scheme. The impact in the growers is becoming very noticeable. We've only really been picking, other than one farm started just over a week ago, on 4 farms now for the last sort of 48 hours. We're seeing about a 50% reduction in the labour available for flowers, and that could be that direct labour not being able to come in from Eastern Europe primarily. New demands from flower pickers. This is becoming evident in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, where, without being overly derogatory, the flower pickers now sort of pretty much dictate the sort of the type of crop that they will pick. The sort of, we think, certainly up here in Scotland, the days are gone of a leader pick and a final pick. They tend to be smaller volumes as opposed to the big 2 picks in the middle. So the pickers are now sort of starting to dictate what type of crop they're picking. I didn't really want to mention COVID in terms of the impact, but it's massive in terms of up here. Hospitality industry is closed, so in our case, the caravan sites that house these pickers for the sort of 6-8 week flower season, they are closed, their staff are furloughed, and they're not prepared to open on the basis there's no sign of hospitality in terms of the holiday season opening. So our biggest issue, as well as lack of labour, is we have 50% of the accommodation. So if we look in terms of converting these sort of challenges into potential opportunities, what might the future look like? We believe there will be less pickers available unless we get access to that SAWS scheme in the future. Benefits to the community, we all know what they are. These pickers, you know, they work incredibly hard. They don't have a lot of time off, apart from maybe 1 day a week, but they do, you know, put money back into the community. One of my biggest bugbears is the label of sort of skilled and unskilled, and flower picking is often deemed unskilled. It's far from that. I'll give you an example from yesterday. The average of our flower pickers yesterday made £16 an hour. That £16 an hour is basically sort of converted into £770 a week. If we were to pick flowers all year long, that would be 40,000. The top picker was £25 an hour, £1,000 a week, and if all year long would be 52,000 a year. So far from unskilled, very talented individuals that work incredibly hard. I think as an industry, we have to work closer in terms of the movement of labour between sectors. So looking at the flower industry moving into fruit, the fruit moving into the sort of veg, and working more cooperatively and collaboratively. So to summarise, access to the SAWS scheme is paramount. We're going to survive as an industry. We have to be part of that scheme. Remove the tag of sort of non-essential crop or non-essential sort of industry. Promote heavily the sort of health and well-being benefits. We see that worldwide. People are buying more flowers, and now primarily that is potentially COVID driven. But we need to promote the industry. And if we take a leaf out of the Dutch book, where, as we all know, the sort of flower industry is one of the largest industries in the country, then it's something that we should be emulating as an industry across here in the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Mark. That was great. If I can now pass on to Francis to give the second grow perspective, covering the situation at Volmary. Thank you, Francis.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me, Wayne?
Can indeed.
My brief today was similar to Mark, was to look at sourcing and managing labour at the EU exit. Obviously, as an early utiliser of labour, we started taking people on in January of this year, so we've got some experience of how this year is panning out already. I have to say it's quite challenging. To start with, tell you a little bit about us. We're part of Volmary Group. We're an independent young talent seed company. Our head office is based in northern Germany, in Zenden. Is our main production facility. As a group, we're producing in excess of 200 million young plants a year over 6 sites based over Europe. We are based in, as Wayne's already alluded to, we're based in Wisbech, Mary, and we are a 20-acre of glass with 5 acres of polythene. What I thought I'd start with today is just sort of breaking down our labour and how we use the labour as a business. We have a total of 180 staff in peak season. Regularly, our regular staff are 65 people all year round. That's direct labour. That doesn't include our indirect labour managers and hanger-ons like me. Previously, we've always used POPs as our sort of seasonal agricultural worker scheme, and we have caravans on site which house up to 28 people. Locally, we've been able to advertise and get 25 people thereabouts. That's becoming more difficult. And to sort of manage our peak, we've used agency, and we've tended to use 2 main agencies locally, and we've had up to 62 agencies from those people to help us with our peak season. Following the EU exit, what are our challenges? Well, the biggest one I think we see as a business is the SAWS scheme, which I know has already been discussed with yourselves. Ornamentals obviously not being classed as essential has had a massive impact on us, and obviously not having access to the pilot scheme. Already mentioned is furlough. I think as an industry we probably hoped that furlough, people who are on furlough may no longer be on furlough and will give us an access to a pool of people. As that scheme has been extended, as has already been alluded to, that is not going to be an option for us this year. We also have less local available labour. I would go as far as to say that some of the Eastern Europeans now see the British market as hostile. We've had people who've worked for us for many years who are not coming back, gone to other European countries because the rights to work are much easier for them. And that has had a big impact for us. And obviously, I think also locally with us, we're having a rates war with the agencies. We have one agency who is no longer working with us. They are based in Peterborough. They are supplying people such as Amazon, who are able to pay a much higher rate than we can offer. what about solutions? What are we doing? We have made use this year of the settled and pre-settled status. Many of the Eastern Europeans already had access. We are working with a former HOPS agency in Romania, and they have helped us to bring people into the country. Obviously, having done that in January, we were also able to not have to use the testing. This is now obviously mandatory when people are coming into the country, but obviously we made sure that everybody went into self-isolation for 10 days. We looked after them in the caravans. We used each caravan as a bubble, and everybody there was, we made sure they had food and they were looked after fully. And then once they had their 10-day isolation, then they were able to come to work as standard protocol. Local labour, we've tried to think about the box a little bit, and it might be a little bit basic, but we've actually erected a banner outside the nursery. I have to say it's proved surprisingly successful. It's a very cheap method of advertising. I think each banner cost us £200, and it's one of these ideas that can be very easily overlooked. I know that we did. To give you an idea, this is our banner is very bright, very yellow, and the two main roads passing the nursery, and we are quite pleasantly surprised at the number of people that have come onto the nursery looking for work due to the banners. Working with smaller agencies, we have found, obviously being forced by having our agency in Peterborough sort of letting us down, that we've gone out looking for smaller agencies, local agencies that are better placed and probably understand our business better. They also seem to have better access to workforce more locally. I think you understand the type of work that we require, and I think this is quite important and has proved quite successful. I think the other thing going forward is we need to look at how, as a business, what we're doing with more long-term solutions to labour. We've got a very well-respected MVQ level 3 and 2 schemes that we're trying to work with. We are working with a local academy in Holbeach that are able to award the MVQ level 2 and level 3 schemes. We have a classroom on the nursery. Obviously, pre-COVID, the assessor would come in once a week, work with the guys to obviously help them towards their level 2 and level 3. And many of these guys have been retained and are still on the nursery, so they've become a very important part of our growing team. There's a couple of administrators, a few other supervisors as well, so they have been a very important progression of the business. And we've recently hosted the regional AHDB Smart Hawk event, and I suppose that's looking at efficiencies really and how to improve efficiencies with our business. We've looked at areas of the business that we felt were a little bit needed investigation, and using the lean process, which is essentially what the Smart Hawk looks at, how we've tried to reduce those areas of the business and obviously reduce the labour. We're also looking at ideas for going forward. As a business, we are also investing in options to mechanise. A big part of our labour is sticking of cuttings. If I give you an example, this week we're sticking 2.5 million cuttings, and we have some 60 people trying to put cuttings into cells. So it's a very labour-intensive part of what we're doing. We're looking at sticking machines. I hope my video is going to work, but we're sticking 24 hours a day, 6,000 cuttings per hour, and they can be contained together so that going forward, a couple of people can run through these, and hopefully maybe looking at these sort of options will help us reduce our peak labour requirements. And that really is us. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that, Francis. And now something slightly different just to finish on and look into the future. We have Jacqui Green talking about the future of app-based labour recruitment. So over to Jacqui, thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope this will be useful. I apologise, I didn't get to see the start of this presentation, so if I repeat anything, please excuse me. So I am standing in for David Trehane, who founded CropDesk Technologies several years ago, and part of that is seasonaljobs.io, but I'll explain that later. And as you've just said, his title was the future of app-based labour recruitment. So that is what I'm going to be sharing with you for the next 15 or 20 minutes. So again, this has probably already been covered, but just to remind ourselves on the traditional recruitment routes. So we've had obviously returnees, which on most UK farms probably represented between 60 and 80% of the seasonal labour. New recruits via those returnees, be that family members, friends, and so forth. Agencies, so both specialist and non-specialist, in-country recruitment, so actually physically going to recruitment centres in the source countries, both local and national traditional advertising. So I thought a lovely shop window there with lots of postcards in would do the job for that. And also social media and website notices, engagement with Job Centre Plus, student fairs and trade events, and jobs board. So those have always been the traditional routes. And again, I don't need to tell you this, and certainly you'll have heard this afternoon, but these routes are either compromised or no longer available due to the shortage of overseas labour and the advent of Brexit. And I think it's important that we do remember and recognise that Brexit has exacerbated this problem, but actually the shortage of overseas labour preceded that by some years. So what are our options? Our options are to engage with mainstream and specialist agencies, to establish an in-house team who can actively advertise and source labour on behalf of the business, add yet more weight to the Pick for Britain, Feed the Nation style campaigns, raise awareness, and then post vacancies on jobs boards that are associated with those campaigns. Actively or even more active engagement with Job Centre Plus and the new Work Coach network. Continue campaigning for seasonal worker permits for non-edible horticulture. I'm sure nobody's going to stop doing that anyway. Continue to lobby for temporary jobs to be added to the occupation shortage list. Create more roles, I guess, at sufficient level to be applicable in the point scheme. And then, of course, if we've just literally just seen, automate, mechanise, and potentially reduce range in favour of ease and efficiency. So there are options, but let's sort of discuss each of them in turn, because I think it's fair to say that many of them probably have got a relatively low hit rate or are very, very costly. These are all sort of very generic, and I guess a lot of these numbers have come from our discussions with growers as we've been looking at the commercialisation of seasonal jobs. But we found that agencies, on average, growers are feeding back that on average there's a 15 to 20% salary fee for the sort of more high street agencies. An in-house team, yes, would be an in-house resource, but the cost to the business just for the person to do that is probably £25,000. And on top of that, all of the advertising, be that traditional advertising or social media advertising. The campaigns about raising awareness, great. The jobs board's fantastic, but almost every grower fed back this sort of very sort of difficult ratio between the amount of CVs they had to sift through in order to find somebody who may be suitable. And then, as you can see with that headline there from the Telegraph last April, only 112 of the applicants for fruit pickers, apologies, actually took jobs, which, you know, in the end, with farmers able to find routes around bringing overseas labour and isolation, turned out not to be a disaster. But certainly there was this issue around suitability. Job centre success rate for long-term stayers is low, so whilst it may proffer a good number of candidates, the sort of staying potential is low. And then continue to campaign, but as I've put there, you know, the seasonal worker permits for non-edible horticulture, as we know, are a low priority for government. And likewise, less skilled jobs being added to the occupation shortage list is again at odds with government manifesto, despite, as we've got the quote there from Minette Batters, where Boris said he would rather die than hurt British farmers. I guess, as I said, we could create more roles of a sufficient level to be applicable in the point scheme, but ultimately that salary baseline may be very hard to reach, especially in a seasonal job capacity, but also in terms of the points for levels of English, that may well be hard to meet as well. And of course, the automation side, yes, holds, I'm sure, many of the answers, but it's got a very high cost of entry and a very long return on investment period. So what technologies already exist that we could adapt or emulate? So Couple, many of you may know about, really was designed for the hospitality industry. It's a very metropolitan service, so it tends to be found in big cities and towns. And it was initially created around the hospitality industry. and was around basically having a resident workforce who were rated. So they were rated in terms of their experience and their reliability. And also they created a bespoke kind of category of job titles. And ultimately, this is designed for a big restaurant that suddenly realizes they're 5 people short for a shift or a big function they're running, and literally are able to sort of mobilize people into immediate vacancies, often just for a few hours at the drop of a hat. But it's very costly, and Coopel themselves actually do all the admin, all the payroll, and they have their own rating system and algorithm to match would-be candidates to the roles. But actually it's quite a costly system, because clearly it's designed around that immediacy and the ultra flexibility of being able to bring somebody in at the drop of a hat for literally 2 to 3 hours, and they have about 17% gross margin, so that gives you an indication of how costly it is. But it has been hugely successful, and there's an example there from HelloFresh, who found 100 people within 2 weeks, and Just Eat, who actually have got a sort of pool of people through Coopel, and they're able to have a kind of pool of flexi workers that they can pull on as and when. And Just Eat is a classic example of where they literally need people for the hour that everyone wants their pizzas delivered on a Saturday night, so that they need that ultimate flexibility. So interesting model, but quite costly. And there's other technology that's a little bit like that. So there's Catapult, which is similar in that it focuses on kind of immediacy of availability, but this is largely designed to support businesses where they've got multiple sites, and so it's actually designed for the existing workforce. So an example might be Marks and Spencer's, for example, in Cheltenham might need 2 extra people, and Marks and Spencer's in Gloucester has excess people, and so they can move sort of existing workforce around. So it's quite neat, and again focuses on that immediacy, and all of the workforce would have that app on their phone. But again, clearly it's about the existing workforce, so there's no need to check people's suitability. They're already employed and they're already doing that role. And then you've got things like Employ, which I've just screenshotted onto the screen there, and Monster and Total Jobs. And, you know, they are expensive. They are often, yeah, between 130, 150 pounds to post a role. And normally that gives you 6 weeks exposure. But during that time, they will publish the vacancies across a number of job sites. But I think the important thing here is that is designed around a single role. And if you're a farm looking to employ 20 to 50 people at a time, it can become quite costly. So I think those areas are quite suitable for salaried roles and the higher sort of salary role, but actually become quite costly. So good technology exists, but as I said, I guess you pay for what you get, which is this kind of immediacy and exposure. And I guess the other thing we could do is we could look at sort of taking a leaf out of Australia's book. So Australia require, I think it's about just under 100,000 workers to bring in the fruit harvest every year, and historically that's been made up of about 45% backpackers, about 10% grey nomads, which are Australians who've chosen to live a life on the road and pick fruits to sort of keep going, and then a very specific scheme around Pacific Islanders. And clearly this year that's been massively compromised by the lack of backpackers, because people haven't been travelling, and also Australia locking down the borders, so the Pacific Islanders were actually unable to come into the country. And so what you find in Australia is any number, and this is literally just 2 of them, any number of Facebook pages where people effectively use them as jobs boards. But I guess the difference here is the momentum behind people wanting to follow these Facebook pages, and people actually wanting to find work because they want to finance their backpacking trip, or they want to have a different kind of experience. So the reason I've just put these up is just to draw your attention to the fact these are just 2 of many Facebook pages, and both of these have got nearly 100,000 followers. And if we think that the need in the UK for agriculture on seasonal workers is probably 50,000, it just sort of feels like maybe there's some work to do there. And I guess that sort of social media audience is actually where we should be spending our time. And I think it's fair to say Australia's got a bit more than just the work, and actually are sort of putting themselves out there as the best fun you can have in your gap year, whilst helping out farmers. And that's an interesting thing we've noted actually, is that in Australia, that there are a number of charities actually that exist around supporting farmers. So although this is called Go and Pick, the campaign's Go and Pick, if you can see in the top left there, Thankful for Farmers is actually a registered charity. So it's a very kind of government-led response, and yeah, obviously the climate helps, and a whole lot more fun besides. So ultimately, what do we need to do? We need to reach a big demographic of these prospective employees without incurring these kind of big costs. So looking at social media in the UK, Facebook has 45 million users who spend an average of 23 minutes a day. It's a young demographic, so over half of the demographic is between 18 and 34 years old. It's got very inexpensive and very targeted advertising. You can be very pinpoint with location, demographic, and any number of interests and hobbies and indicators of people's preferences, but also their skills. And then Instagram, 30 million users that spend on average 32 minutes a day. Young demographic again, actually sort of slightly higher in the older bracket of the demographic, so the 25 to 34-year-olds. But again, very visual, and reacts really well to high visual content, be that films or be that photos, and a very high advertisement frequency. But again, you can be very, very specific in the way you use it. But social media isn't the sort of panacea. Businesses need to be really intentional and invest a lot of time into it. And social media is definitely not a jobs board. You know, you have to ensure that those prospective employees find you. If you're a brand or you're trading or selling, then you can convert clients into prospective employees, or you need your network to share and become effectively ambassadors on your behalf. So there is a push-pull in this, and a need for the momentum to be very much generated. It isn't going to come and find you. So it'd be nice to think that's all sorted. Well, sadly not. It's a kind of needle in a haystack, really. So we need to take action. So we need to recognise that we need to go and find these people. We need to work together as an industry to build awareness. And clearly the campaigns from last summer had a huge, huge impact in terms of awareness. We need to use social media, but be very intentional with it, and try and sort of replace these costly online agencies with low-cost solutions, but that have a high hit rate. We need to remain fleet of foot and dynamic, because as the position clarifies, and I guess as furlough ends, and I'm sure the government will introduce a number more schemes in terms of supporting people into work, we need to be able to remain flexible and fleet of foot. We know our target demographics and we know where they hang out. We need to continue to lobby government and make more noise. And one thing's for sure, we're better together than apart. But all of these things really factored in prompted David to apply for some funding from Innovate UK. So in CropDesk Technologies, David has been busily building a suite of software solutions for farms that end up kind of talking together, a kind of hub and spoke model. But what he recognised as he was talking to growers is that actually, if labour doesn't get sorted, then all of the rest of it is almost irrelevant. So he recognised that actually, with his grower experience and his software hat on, he was actually in a position to sort of support growers, and hence applied for funding from Innovate UK. And so the Seasonal Jobs app was born. In a nutshell, a brief word on seasonal jobs. So it isn't a jobs board, it actually is an app that uses an algorithm. So it's a low-cost version of some of those apps I showed you earlier, in as much as it uses an algorithm to seek out prospective candidates and use a matching formula to match candidates to roles based on a number of criteria, namely location, availability, skills, fitness level, and any other matching criteria that are needed, for example, experience and numbers of years of doing a role. And it also triggers a social media campaign to advertise to specific candidates that have those specific credentials, and it does it two ways. In the initial setup, it triggers a social media campaign with national awareness that then targets specific locations. But once the location has been established, and once those roles are established, then it actually uses a social media technique, which is well known, which is really looking for lookalike. So it actually uses the lookalike marketing in order to trigger a social media campaign to find lookalikes to the existing candidates. but it also helps manage expectations. So a number of the roles actually have accompanying videos with them so that candidates can actually see what the job entails. And by asking a number of questions and having these matching criteria, it just reduces that ratio of 10 to 1 I showed you earlier in the sifting process, but also reduces the percentage of no stays. And David devised it to be completely sector, role, country, function agnostic. It can literally be adapted to any role, be that full-time or be that hourly paid, and fundamentally it can be molded to your business and your industry, even to the point of having specific job titles that you may choose to use, albeit they'll be branded and grouped under specific headings. So that's sort of seasonal jobs in a nutshell. Today isn't about showing you a demo, but please do feel free to contact us if you would like a demo. And that's it from me. That's our website, so you can get in touch with us through that, seasonaljobs.io. And thank you very much for listening. And now back to you in terms of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqui. If I can ask all the speakers now just to activate their microphones and webcams. We've had a few questions come in, so I'll go through them in a chronological order, and I've got one or two I want to pose as well. So the first two I will try and merge together because they're of a similar sort of vein. I will slightly amend Alan's first question, which was how many seasonal workers do we think that the ornamental sector requires? And Andrew's made a comment about that. If we only get 30,000, then that's only 50% even for the edible sector. So perhaps Ali, David, do you want to make any comment about the ornamental sector demands and this 50% of maximum workforce?
Yes, thank you. And it's a great question. I should have made it perhaps a little bit clearer. So the 70 to 80,000 is the total for horticulture. And for me, that's fruit, veg, plants and flowers. The number actually in ornamental horticulture is a number that has been hard to get at, but we estimate it to be about 10 to 12,000. And just moving on to the second part of the question about if ornamental growers are excluded from the pilot, then we expect to have a maximum workforce of 50%. It really doesn't work like that. If all horticulture needs 70 to 80,000 and we've got 30 coming from the pilot, obviously EU workforce with settled and pre-settled, that is still a route, and we expect it to still be a sizable route. What I was trying to give was a feeling of the levels of confidence about how many would return and that returnee rate dropping. So it's an unknown, but there are forgive me, I should know this number, it's at least 1.6 million EU nationals with settled or pre-settled status, so it's a big pool. The problem is that it will diminish over time, and that's where the future of the pilot becoming a fully scaled up scheme for all of horticulture, including non-edible, is really important. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Ali. David, anything to add? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think I guess the settled status scheme is obviously the key one to push here. So, if businesses have workers who haven't registered through that scheme yet, that's probably a really high priority action for me. It's 30th of June is the deadline for that. So if you've got people registered through that, then they'll be able to travel and be employed by you in the future.
Thank you, David. The third question is more of a statement, but if I turn it into a question and pose it first of all to Francis and Mark for their opinion, and then perhaps come back to Ali. Andrew sort of said, don't forget that edible horticulture is exempt from quarantining workers coming into the UK, but ornamentals has a quarantine period to observe. So can I ask Francis and perhaps Mark first about your experiences with quarantining or potentially going to have to quarantine your seasonal labour, Mark?
Yeah, so going back to Scottishism, so in effect, I'll give you a good example from last week. So pretty much apart from one, all our grower members are potato growers as well as flower and bulb producers. So 3 of them brought in very small numbers, 2 and 3 of their potato grading squad, in from Bulgaria, Romania and Latvia, 3 different countries, on the basis they were going to farm to grade potatoes, straight through with all the correct documentation, onto farm, no quarantining. The aspect of the non-essential flower pickers cannot come into the country. They could go and quarantine at £1,750 to stay in a travel lodge at Edinburgh Airport, which is never going to happen. So we've got this real issue of that, as I say, that 15–20% that cannot physically come in unless an extortion amount of money to, and then also be tested on day 2 and day 8 because of that non-essential status that we fall into for flower production.
Thank you, Mark. Anything to add to that, Francis?
I think for us, we were fortunate, as I said in my presentation, that we were very early when we were bringing people over. I think you've got to look at the gov.uk site because I think the requirements are changing all the time. My understanding is, as Mark just stated, that anybody coming over now has to be tested on day 2, day 8. I think just look at the gov.uk and keep abreast of the changes that are happening.
Thank you, Francis. Ali, any comments beyond what Francis and Mark have?
I have just tried, I don't know whether it's gone in, but I have just tried to post a link for everybody because this is a complex area. First of all, and let's just pull apart quarantining and day 2 and day 8 testing. They are different and they're different exemptions. Firstly, quarantining, all seasonal workers, edible and non-edible, if they are able to go directly to the farm or the business that they are due to work on, they can quarantine on that business. Now, I accept that not everybody has got on business, on farm accommodation. But if you have, then those workers, regardless of whether they're edible or non-edible, can quarantine in that accommodation and go straight to work. Yes, Mark, come back at me. This may be different, of course, in Scotland.
It's completely different. We sit on a Horti ministerial call every 2 weeks and have done for exactly 12 months. And I posed that question to the Minister about a month ago. They went away, thought about it and said, no, if it's edible, so your potato grading staff can come in, non-essential flower picking, no.
So I'm afraid, obviously I represent the NFU in England and Wales, and I have colleagues who do the equivalent in Scotland. I would like to check because, of course, this is national, UK-wide immigration policy. We could take this offline and just see if that needs to be challenged. But in England and Wales, I'm absolutely 100% clear, edible and non-edible seasonal staff, if they can go to live in or on the accommodation that's in that business, they may quarantine in the business and go straight to work. And then I was, sorry, Mark, go on.
No, carry on.
And then with regard to day 2 and day 8 testing, I've actually been WhatsApping because I saw that question. Now, my understanding until a few days ago, apparently it's just changed again, was that day 2 and day 8 testing, again, there was an exemption that applied to all seasonal workers. I've just been told that within the last few days, it's been clarified as just edible. So I've raised that now. That needs to go back to DEFRA ASAP because that's astonishing. But the day 2 and day 8 testing exemption is temporary, and we are right in the middle of trying to get clarification as to what is going to happen for the rest of the season. The exemption was made because, of course, this day 2 and day 8 testing was brought in a rush, like a lot of our COVID regulation, and we got that exemption, but it was only temporary. So I'm afraid on day 2 and day 8 testing, it's watch this space. On quarantining for edible and non-edible, I think we need to take the Scottish issue away and actually check the law, because a minister or MP saying something isn't quite the same as the law.
Okay, thank you, Ali. If we can continue with you with the next question, because it's an interesting question to pose. So if I go to you first, Ali, and then perhaps seek feedback from Mark and Francis afterwards. Question from Chris here, so saying, during the 1980s, prior to the availability of European labour, some businesses in the south of England to recruiting labour from areas of the UK with higher unemployment levels. Do the speakers feel this might be an option in the future here? So Ali, have you got any comments on that one, please?
So there's so many layers to answer this, and Chris Moncrief, thank you very much. Great question, and nice to see you listening in. The first thing is the seasonal nature of the work does not always suit a resident population that has to pay rent or a mortgage. We're in a very developed first world economy, and seasonal work is difficult for a resident population. The second thing is that many of the businesses that I represent are rural or in what I would call non-populous areas. More than half of the soft fruit in the country is grown over here in Herefordshire and Worcestershire, and the levels of unemployment in our two local small cities, Hereford and Worcester, are relatively low even today. And so the idea that those cities would be able to, that the urban population would be able to fulfill these roles, going back to 2019, there were a few hundred people unemployed. There was over 5,000 seasonal workers needed just in Herefordshire. So the two don't tally up. And then you've got the question of, would people move from large urban populations to take these jobs in in rural areas? And what we found last year, in the early part of last year, when of course there was a period where we thought our borders were going to close, so take you back to last March, April, there was a threat that our borders were going to close, and there was a huge effort by growers to recruit from a domestic workforce, and there were large numbers coming forward from what I would call areas which are some distance, so York, Nottingham, cities in the Midlands and North, not necessarily close to horticultural enterprises. And of course, the reason why there was such a high drop-off was they didn't want to move. Now, some of that you could argue is COVID, but it's not all COVID. They don't want to move, they don't want to make that lock, stock and barrel move to live in or near the business for the period of season that is required. And then if you go back to my recruiting from local cities, the challenge then is providing transport. Now, there are some very successful businesses around me in the Evesham area that are running buses in and out of Birmingham on a regular basis. So the answer to the question is yes and no.
Thank you, Ali. Any experiences from Francis and Mark on this?
I think only experience I've got again is labour coming from Peterborough. Also, is an understanding of the work required. It's coming from an urban environment into what is essentially our greenhouses, and it's not the work for them.
Can I?
Thank you.
Sorry, just that.
Oh, sorry, Jacqui. Yeah, please.
We've got sort of over 4 million people with either settled or pre-settled status, not necessarily physically in the UK, but able to work in the UK. And I think that the difficulty here is that sort of, you know, what's deemed sort of official unemployed and what is seasonal work, because I think a number of the people we recognise who are seeking work are actually those who have been temporarily laid off because they're perhaps in the hospitality sector, or, you know, more tragically, maybe permanently laid off because of the end of the furlough scheme. So I completely agree with what Ali just said. The actual numbers in terms of unemployed is incredibly low, but I guess the idea of the Seasonal Jobs Act, for example, is actually to go for a national campaign in order to work out who is prepared to move and actually demonstrate to them through the candidate profiles that the growers can put in that they have got accommodation or they have got some sort of transport arrangement. So I think there are ways and means to sort of piece this together. I think it's just about everybody recognising that it isn't as simple as you're going to find your labour on your doorstep or within 10 miles, even notwithstanding the fact that transport routes within rural areas are not particularly well serving for growers. But I think the important thing really is that a lot of these sort of settled and pre-settled workers wouldn't necessarily deem themselves to be unemployed. They're possibly temporarily out of work because of the hospitality sector being closed. So I think there's actually more to go at. But I think the important thing is this sort of national campaign rather than looking at things in local and regional prospects.
Thank you, Jacqui. If I combine Robin's two questions into one and pose them to Mark and Francis, the question basically is: are growers experiencing difficulties with some other growers paying cash and undercutting? So Mark, any experiences there, please?
On the basis we're a cooperative, you would think that that would be a relatively easy one to sort of manage in terms of what pickers are paid per bunch, but that would be horribly wrong. For the last sort of 50 years, the growers are in effect competing for labour. The growers who have accommodation on their farms, it's much easier to attract labour than the guys that don't have accommodation on their farms. Historically, that would have been the main daily paid casuals, as we call, where they were paid off at the end of the day and there was no sort of particular contract. That sort of changed. They're all sort of registered and pay national insurance. So the sort of industry has changed completely. And I think as a consequence that we actually attract probably more pickers. The same pickers come back to the same farms every year, knowing that they'll make a lot of money. Going back to the previous question, we had a picker on one farm who started on Sunday, never picked daffodils in his life. By 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, he'd made £72 for his day. He'd picked 8 trays of flowers at £9 an hour. And yet we cannot get people out of the local towns and villages that in theory, they're going to make, £450. 2 days training, £450 a week. Gross.
Thank you,
gross.
Francis, any experiences about paying cash, undercutting?
I don't think it's cash. I'm not aware of anybody paying cash. What I do think is, though, as people running businesses, we've all got to manage our own labour, and I think ultimately I was talking to another nursery locally who are looking at whether they're going to put up their hourly rates in order to attract labour above other businesses. We've all got to get the crops grown and get the crops out the door. So I think as individuals and individual businesses, we're all going to have to make those decisions.
Okay. We've only got 2 or 3 minutes left, so I've got 3 quick questions. So if I can quickly ask Francis, Mark and Jacqui a question each. Francis, your mechanisation policy, is that just to deal with peak demands, or is that going to be a continuous implementation?
I think it's something we've got to look at. I think it's something we're all very scared of. We've made lots of excuses, like we grow too many varieties and how difficult it is. But I think ultimately the labour issue is going to get harder, and I think it's got to become a long-term policy going forward that we have to discuss it and tackle it no matter how difficult it is.
Okay, Mark. How are you finding the new regulations impacting the movement of labour up the country and actually retainment by yourselves on your Scottish farms? Is that really impacting now, or have you yet to experience that?
In terms of ability to come north, Scottish Government made it sort of quite clear about 6 weeks ago that would be allowed, which was a real boost to our industries. So in fairness, hats off to Scottish Government for that one. In terms of the sort of movement at this stage, we would be 50% down on what we need. That is the impact of COVID in the hospitality sector being closed. So it's accommodation. We believe we could get our 300 pickers if we had another 50% accommodation to house them.
Okay, thank you. And then just to finish, Jacqui, the seasonal jobs app, is this just being developed for agriculture, horticulture, or is it for seasonal labour across the board? And which are your target industries, if that's the case?
Yeah, no, the first rollout was designed around agricultural labour, but we've been looking into food manufacturing and hospitality when it reopens. So it can be used across any sector. I think the beauty of it is that the matching criteria are the important bit. So if you're specifically looking for a skill set or specific experience or a qualification around being a tractor driver or a bus driver, they can all be matching criteria. So it can be designed to fit in any industry. But we've chosen agriculture because it's close to all of our hearts, and David's a grower and a nurseryman as well. So that's why that's been our sort of pilot rollout. But the idea is we're in discussion with partners around it being for other industries and indeed overseas. So we're actually talking to organisations in Australia to see if we can help them with their difficulty as well.
Thank you, Jacqui.
Thank you.
It's just gone past now, so if I can just quickly ask Heather to transfer the screen to myself, just for the last slide I've got, just to sort of tie everything together. So hopefully, if it does, if I can move to slideshow, there you go. So it just to sort of say thank you to all our presenters. Who's done some wonderful presentations today, including Ali, David, Mark, Francis, and Jacqui. If you do want to download the handout, you've got a few seconds left, so please click on the icon and download the handout now. If you do have any further questions, or if any questions come to you in the next day or two, please pass them to me at that email address, and I'll pass them on to the presenters. As I said, the recording will be made available next week, well, hopefully later this week, but if not next week. And in terms of a quick promo, look out for our technical IPM webinars in April, but also for the first 6 Smart Talk modules, which are now online, and there's the address there. So if you are interested in delving into Smart Talk, please click the link to find out more. And with that, I thank all the speakers, and I thank everybody for joining in today, and good luck for the up and coming season. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.